While the whole world, and rightfully so, of course, is watching the Gaza Strip, the United States is opening a new front, this time in Venezuela. Military operations, massive bombings, political pressure everywhere. All of this is part of a single message. Washington does not want to lose influence either in the Middle East or in Latin America. Today, we're going to analyze what's really happening and why Venezuela could become the next epicenter of global geopolitics. And what does the Gaza Strip have to do with all of this? Let's start, as usual, from the beginning. And in this regard, we must specifically mention the Gaza Strip, where just a few hours ago, Israel launched its ground operation, which is clearly a low. Most of the world has recognized this, including the United Nations, which is not exactly suspected of being a pro-Russian organization. Whatever the case may be, that's what matters to us. Here, of course, the issue is humanitarian, which in fact I explained to you in detail yesterday in a separate video, where I explain what can be done to help the Gaza Strip, which is indeed possible. But the second point, which is no less important, is the military and media aspect. I wanted to say, because it's no coincidence that the tension from the United States has been increasing on several fronts at the same time. And the truth is, without United States support, Israel wouldn't have been able to take even the smallest step inside the Gaza Strip. Because it's not just political support that's needed, at the very least, logistical support is also necessary. Washington, especially Donald Trump, gave Netanyahu the green light, and meanwhile, it kept increasing. In other words, as harsh as it may sound, Gaza is just the pretext to show power between the United States and Israel in the Middle East. On the other hand, Venezuela is being used as this same excuse, but to do it in Latin America, in this very particular case. The United States is not only threatening Venezuela with this increasingly growing military contingent that it is bringing directly to its shores, but it has already moved to action, carrying out not one or two, but 3 direct attacks against that country, 2 motorboats and a tuna fishing vessel in particular, which have been attacked by the United States. In the first case, there are reports of 11 fatalities. In the second, well, actually the third, if we speak in chronological terms, there are 3 fatalities and a tuna fishing boat that was held for 8 hours by a United States military ship. Meanwhile, Venezuela is denouncing a direct attack on its sovereignty and putting its troops on high alert, preparing for whatever may come. The United States is taking advantage of the situation not only to send a message of power, but also to keep Russia and China in check in the region. On one hand, to control the oil, on the other, and thirdly, here, almost in personal terms regarding Donald Trump, to leave a somewhat contradictory image. I mean, on one hand, seriously, you can't take a United States threat lightly, because it's not just any country on the international stage. On the other hand, Donald Trump. He hasn't been able to handle the Ukrainian conflict, or any of the other conflicts currently affecting world peace. Well, yes, unfortunately, he has intensified the conflict in the Gaza Strip. But besides that, his power hasn't been good for anything except destruction, bombing boats in the local Venezuelan sea. Of course, the United States is doing all of this under the pretext of protecting its own security. Well, if there wasn't an excuse about weapons of mass destruction, they had to come up with something for this story. Why eliminate bombings? Why bomb boats in Venezuelan waters? Therefore, the people inside those boats, we're talking about 14 people in particular, are not big bosses or anything like that. At most, they're just pawns in charge of taking the goods to the United States. Of course, this won't change anything at all within the distribution chain. In the United States, they're not so foolish as to not know this fact. So they're actually doing it on purpose, using the excuse to build a certain image for themselves, which here could have a double meaning. And you tell me, which one would you choose? The one of the extremely dangerous Uncle Sam to be feared, or the one of the absolute ridicule they're making of themselves, that they can't handle anyone, except for a few poor drug traffickers, and not even that almost in Venezuelan waters. Because, of course, once the boats are destroyed, we really have no way of knowing who was on board or what they were carrying. We have to rely, as always, on the word of the United States, which has already led the world to dozens, if not directly hundreds, of conflicts. And now we've really reached that key point where the United States uses its usual strategy. We didn't start this report by talking about the Gaza Strip just for no reason. On one hand, I think it's important to remember everything possible about the humanitarian catastrophe that the usual ones are exposing the weakest and most vulnerable to. But on the other hand, divide and conquer has never disappeared from the geopolitical stage, and in this case, what they're trying to divide is public opinion. I believe both the United States and Israel are acting on their respective fronts. On one hand with the Gaza Strip, and on the other with the Venezuelan issue, to draw the public's attention to each of those 2 points, depending on the most convenient geopolitical moment for it. Obviously, more convenient from the point of view of United States/Israeli interests. That is, if now the United States has to put even more pressure on Venezuela, then Israel draws media attention to the issue of the Gaza Strip and, respectively, vice versa. The ultimate goal, for the United States to get involved more or less directly in both conflicts, I think is quite clear. On one hand, in the case of the Gaza Strip, to provide support to Israel and gain additional control in the region, or at least not lose its influence there. On the other hand, in the Venezuelan case, perhaps more than gaining influence, it's about limiting the influence that other countries, such as Russia and China, are trying to exert or are already exerting. Or in other words, trying to keep in check the, I believe, absolutely inevitable advance of the global South. The strategy they use is well known, that of a hybrid war. That is, they mix sanctions, covert military operations, direct military operations, like in the case of the Gaza Strip, massive bombings, and media pressure. In short, any tool is welcome to maintain, at any cost, United States hegemony. And the price for all of this is extremely high. In the case of the Gaza Strip, we're talking about a real humanitarian crisis and a very high possibility that a regional war could break out. In the case of Venezuela, we're also facing a possible open conflict. And in addition, significant destabilization of the region, which after all is exactly what they want. These are the last thrashes of a fish known to be dead, but not yet recognized as such. In what we're seeing, therefore, in Venezuela on one hand, and in the Gaza Strip on the other, they are by no means isolated incidents, but rather 2 parts of a strategy that the United States uses to try to maintain its own power at all costs, increasingly diminished, and therefore increasingly dangerous. And now is when I ask you, do you think these conflicts are going to end up staying exactly where they are? I mean, in terms of simply 2 regional conflicts, or are they going to open the door to something much more dangerous? Which is a new episode of a global war.